Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nonviolent. My name is Erickson. I'm going to reintroduce Ben. Then Suzanne will introduce Andrew and have a discussion with Andrew about his recent work. And then we'll get into the theology of the cross and with Ben. Okay? So Benjamin and I first met recently at a conference, and we hit it off really well, especially talking about the cross and anthropology, and we thought that Ben would be a great guest on the show because while Ben, I don't think, I mean, you have some familiarity with mimetic theory, but haven't studied it a whole lot, but Ben intuits it in a very great way. So we thought it'd be great to have Ben on the show.
Absolutely.
Ben, as he states on his website, formerly Fundy, Ben is an author, a blogger, speaker, minister, and tattoo collector. That's cool, tattoos. He has a Master's of Arts in Theology and Master's of Arts in World Missions, both from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and Ben is currently a doctoral student at Fuller Seminary for the degree of Doctor of Missiology. Ben is a contributor for Sojourners and has been a featured guest on HuffPost Live. HuffPost Live is like a television show, right, Ben? Oh, he said right, but Ben is right. Muted. So,
oh, boy. Okay. Well,
yeah.
we have Andrew right here in the office with us, so that we don't have to mute or unmute you, Andrew, do we?
No, I mean, I can see and hear myself,
Okay.
and he can see you. I can't hear Ben when he speaks. I'm sorry about that.
I know. Well, we'll get back because he was here a minute ago. So, Andrew McKenna, let me give you a brief introduction, and then we'll get started. Andrew McKenna is professor of French language and literature at Loyola University here in Chicago, and he's had a wonderful, long, and productive career there at Loyola, and he is one of Renee Girard's first graduate students. You met at Johns Hopkins when you were doing graduate work. And now, Andrew, as he's getting ready for retirement eventually, we all have to plan for our retirement, he's begun teaching in a new venue at a maximum security prison here in Illinois. And we want to talk with you today, Andrew, about that intersection of your work in mimetic theory, teaching non-incarcerated people, and then moving, or they may argue the point, I suppose, sometimes, and then moving to work in prisons. So, Andrew, if you could just help me extend your introduction just a little bit and explain to us what it was about Renee Girard and mimetic theory that so captivated you as a graduate student and that sort of influenced the course of your life.
Oh, it's been decisive. I have always loved literature for reasons I've written about in an essay on my relationship to Renee's ideas. And I got to Hopkins with a fellowship. I didn't plan to stick with it. I didn't want to be a French teacher. I didn't want to teach humanism at a time which was very flow-ho, sort of loosey-goosey. It had no coherence or nothing very solid. And I had Renee as a teacher. And I thought, my goodness, this redeems the love I have in literature. Literature is not entertainment. It's not show business. Literature is host to ideas and to truth about human relations that we don't find in other areas of thought, not in philosophy and not always in social science. So I got hooked. And I've been doing it for the rest of my, really for the whole of my adult life. It has never disappointed me. I always find new text to teach and new relations in culture and history and society and social sciences that mimetic theory illuminates. So,
right. So Renee, as you're saying, at a time in which everyone was looking for the unique and original voice and contribution of what makes a novelist great, his unique voice. Renee was saying something completely different.
Yes.
And tell us about that.
Well, what he's saying in his first big book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, is that we have to focus not on what is unique about the great writers, but what are the truths, what are the insights that they share. And so he developed this theory that is that all the novelists share certain great truths about human desire, and that it is mimetic, and that it is modeled, it is mediated. And so it's a theory of relations. It's all about relations. It's relations up and down, left and right, east and west. And so it's a dynamic theory as opposed to a punctual theory of literature. This great genius sat down and produced a masterpiece. Well, so what? It's a much more exciting and dynamic theory.
And a theory of violence as well.
Yes, a theory of violence, because at the very base of it, it's an argument that is not hard to make, that if our desires imitate each other among ourselves, if we model our desires on the desires of others, that will work up until the point where the desires converge on an object that we cannot share. And at that point, as we see in a childhood's nursery, there is conflict. So that when desires converge on a desire that cannot be shared, there will be conflict and even violence. This is true in the playground. This is true across international borders.
Yeah.
But what's also true, Andrew, is that most of us will agree with you that, okay, desire leads to conflict, could lead to violence, but that happens to everybody but me. I am not violent. My conflicts would not escalate out of control. And so we live within this sort of diluted sense of self-goodness and peacefulness, if you will. But here you are, Andrew, going into a setting in which your new students are convicted violent offenders, murderers, I think all of them.
Yes.
Who can't deny their own violence. Tell us about these men and the makeup, the racial makeup of your group, and what their reaction is to you bringing a theory of violence into the classroom.
Well, I'm not a social scientist. I'm not a reformer. I'm not a pastor or a minister. I don't bring the theory to the classroom. I bring to the classroom great literature. It's my passion. But the greatest texts really do share certain fundamental truths and common insights. And that's what I bring. And where it interconnects with the population I'm teaching is certainly they know they have, and I quote, made mistakes. But they also know that these mistakes are generated by a systemic situation. There's one word that comes to mind. The school to jail pipeline. They act out in school, and because of more pressure to control bad behavior, they go from school in a zero-tolerance situation to jail, to juvenile. And that's where they really get criminalized, because to defend yourself, to survive, there's violence everywhere, and you exercise it precisely mimetically. It's violence against you. You use your violence. And so the school-to-jail pipeline produces people who eventually go back on the street and become more violent. There's also the question of the devastating underfunding of schooling, and the economic crises in which these populations inhabit. So it's a systemic problem. It's about relations, you see. It's not about this bad guy did this bad thing, so we have a solution, put him or her away. The fact is that mimetic theory is a series of relations, and it responds to their historical experience. And when I teach texts from African-American literature, these are world masterpieces, they're recognized. I can teach them back-to-back with Voltaire. I can teach them back-to-back with Dostoevsky, who narrate the same kind of relational experience rather than punctual individualist responsibility, that idea of the free, autonomous agent who is solely in control of his or her actions and ideas. If that were true, we never could have learned a language, which we have to have learned from an environment of speakers.
Well, how do they, your students then talk about the violence that they've committed? Do they see it as, well, I'm a victim of a systemic, a problem, or how do they talk about why they did what they did?
Well, I don't discuss why they did what they did. That's not my role. Really, that's beyond my competence. But what they do see that what they did was also there's a systemic violence, a social violence in the culture, in the economy, and they're very aware of that. They come from bad neighborhoods and bad schools, and they've done some very bad things. What they see is that a key dimension of mimetic theory is that the agents of violence eventually converge on a scapegoat, and that violence is expelled from the community. What mimetic theory does, it fudges the margin between, let us say, the victim of violence and the performer of violence. Violence is everywhere. By the way, editorial, I have to say that American culture has the largest prison population in the world. It has the largest gun-owning population in the world. Our culture has a romance with violence, which is really unique in the world of modern industrialized nations. And these men understand that it's a systemic issue. It's about relations. It's not about a single perpetrator whose arrest and incarceration will solve the problem of violence.
Right. And in the paper that you wrote that you actually shared with the men in your classes, you talk about this internalizing of violence, that an oppressed group does internalize this violence, and because they can't retaliate. Violence does, as you say, imitate, and you hit me, I hit you. But if you cannot, because of the systemic relationship with your oppressor, if you can't retaliate, where do you go with that violence?
Well, where you go, boss chooses you out, you go home and you kick your dog. The violence that they cannot, but physically, legally, cannot exercise against their oppressors, they take out on one another. And then you have this black on black violence, whose full-bore emergence really follows after the elimination of Jim Crow. But the abuses that Jim Crow were about, we still have those abuses. And, of course, the great literary texts from the African-American tradition testify to that. Malcolm X for one, Richard Wright for another, Ralph Ellison for another, and those are just a few. We have Toni Morrison, we have Zora Neale Hurston. There is a whole archive of literary masterpieces which bring this to the fore in a way that is brought to the fore by Jonathan Swift, by Voltaire, by Dostoevsky, and my interest is showing to these men that they are part of a worldwide conversation, and that their experience of oppression is one that is part of a bigger movement and a bigger form of attention and consciousness that they need to know about.
Andrew, two questions from the chat. One is, what prison are you teaching at?
I'm not allowed to name that. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Because if I say bad things about this institution, they won't let me back in.
Okay, there you go. Good enough.
Right.
And what specific books are you using?
Well, that I can say.
Okay, good.
By the way, this institution, I will say this much: we don't have prisons in this country. We have something that is called correctional facilities. That's a euphemism. And we don't even have prisoners. They're called residents. Now, is that to make them feel better about themselves? No, it's to make us feel better about the fact that we have this scandal called the criminal justice system. Euphemisms are a form of language. I'm a literature and language teacher. Euphemisms are covering over terrible things with pretty words. That said, the text I teach, for instance, Voltaire, Candide, which is all about violence. René has a wonderful lecture on violence where he said, in a sense, Voltaire discovered violence that people do to one another. And that before, people talked about evil, and they talked about devastation, but they didn't get down to the very human form of violence. And that is the greatest form of evil in this world. And the men really resonate with this. They can see it. I taught one chapter from Candide, and later on in the semester I'll teach the whole book. I also teach notes from the underground. Now, that's a very interesting case, because Dostoevsky had an acknowledged influence on Richard Wright when he wrote Native Son, which is about a murderer who really did kill people, just the way Crime and Punishment is about a murderer who really did kill innocent people.
Mm-hmm.
And Richard Wright became the mentor for Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is a world classic. The Invisible Man is an underground man. It begins with a man who was living under the streets of New York, and he was siphoning off electric power to illuminate his illegal space. And the bridge there from Dostoevsky to Wright to Ralph Ellison is one you can connect as far back to Euripides, to Greek tragedy, in which these sacrificial rituals and sacrificial practices are fully dramatized and played out.
Mm-hmm.
And so my aim is simply to help these men see a world. By the way, this is a wonderful phrase I ran across reading about Malcolm X, to see a world that is larger than their grievance. Mm-hmm. They really do have a grievance, and society has a grievance against them. But the solution is simply not to warehouse a population. Mm-hmm. That's a common expression that goes, and by the way, it runs all through the press. What are we accomplishing in any way whatsoever by simply warehousing a population for hugely indefinite periods?
Mm-hmm. Which, I think this might be a good point to bring Ben in, because his conversation is about our relationship between justice and punishment, and that, how that connection got made. If we're punishing people, but we don't say it, we say we're housing them and they're, what was the euphemism? I can't remember. Correcting them or something.
Right, correction facility. Certainly is not a word that belongs there.
Right.
An institution. Sacrifice is an institution. Sacrifice is not a facility.
Yeah. Ben, I want to bring you in now. You have this great blog that focuses on atonement, which is obviously something that we're interested here in nonviolent atonement, teaching nonviolent atonement. But I wanted to ask you if you had any thoughts about the conversation that we just had with Andrew before we get to your specific article.
Sure, I think he's absolutely right. Of course, nonviolence is one of the issues that I talk about most in my writings, and I would just have to completely agree with him that we just have this entire system that's addicted to violence, and nobody seems to be willing to opt out of it. And of course, that's the only way to beat the system, is to refuse to play by the system's rules. But it's disheartening for me at times, and folks just don't tend to see the systemic, how deep things go, and how driven this is through all these systemic violences, especially against minority groups and folks like that. In that things are just ingrained so deeply, and it becomes easy for those perhaps that come from different classes or whatnot to just see the other as being dangerous or being violent or being this or being that, without realizing the systemic injustices that are just absolutely driving and fueling these things, because they haven't been exposed to it. And of course, and they have the talking heads that just continue to feed and fuel misinformation, and it seems believable to folks. But no, Andrew's right. There are all of these systemic violences, systemic injustices, and it's fueling it. But from my standpoint, as an Anabaptist and as a theologian, what I want is to encourage people to opt out of the system entirely, and to beat the game of violence by refusing to use violence of any form.
Yeah. How your article is called "Justice Broken: How a Poor Theology of the Cross Created America's Broken Justice System." Can you say a little bit about that poor theology of the cross that you point to, and then kind of discuss how it's led to this broken system?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, we live in America. I think it's maybe 78% of people, give or take, identify as Christian. And what happened was during the Reformation and kind of this post-Reformation period, for 2,000 years, Christians have been talking about what does the cross mean and what happened on the cross. In about 1000 AD, the concept came that God's wrath was being satisfied and that Jesus was a substitute. But then during the Reformation, they took it one step further and started to see Jesus as being punished in a penal sense, in a legal transaction by God the Father on the cross. And I believe this happened because so many of the theologians in the Reformation were actually lawyers prior to becoming theologians. And we all have these filters, we all have lenses where we kind of read into things and project our own way of seeing the world. And so these really influential theologians who did produce a lot of great stuff, I'm a product of the Protestant Reformation. However, this legal lens, I believe, obscured the true message of the cross. And so as a result, it's been ingrained in our memory for those of us who just grow up seeing the cross and seeing Jesus as being punished as a substitute in our place, taking upon the wrath of God, in that we tend to see justice served as when somebody is fully and completely punished. If you've seen even one episode of The Way of the Master, the truncated gospel, the way they explain it is that you broke a fine and Jesus paid the fine, the judge punished him instead so you can be set free. Again, so it's this legal framework that tells us that justice satisfied means that somebody was punished. And so what that has done is culturally we have taken that on. There's a process called assimilation where Christianity in all cultures has a tendency to assimilate to the culture it's around. And there are some aspects that remain unique and some that just blend to the point where you can't see where Christianity legitimately ends and the culture begins. So we could start to call that the process of assimilation. And so theologically, I believe that this concept of justice has assimilated with Western culture to the point where we see both theologically and in the real world that justice means somebody has to pay. Somebody has to pay. And so as a result, we've developed this entire justice system that, I remember back when I was a conservative and in high school listening to Rush Limbaugh, I still remember him saying, what's the problem with overcrowding prisons? He said, build more prisons. Okay, this is the kind of mindset that a poor theology of the cross has led us to develop, that justice means build more prisons, where instead I believe that if we uncover what really happened on the cross, the Apostle Paul says that God was in Christ with Jesus on the cross and that he was reconciling all things to himself. There was an act of reconciliation. We were the ones who did the violence. We were the ones who nailed Jesus to the cross. We were the ones who put the crown of thorns on his head. The violence came from us. The violence didn't come from God. The cross is an act of reconciliation. And so justice in the Christian tradition becomes that God restored us and reconciled us, not that God punished and the debt was paid that way. I believe, obviously, clearly Jesus did serve as a substitute. You can't ignore that. But it's this idea, the way we work in violence and substitute that with justice. So I think that if we recover a holistic understanding of the atonement, that justice is a life reconciled, not, punishment fully vetted, that it will cause us to start up a new culture in the way we approach the criminal justice system here in America, where we'll focus more on how do we restore lives? How do we restore the victims of crimes that have had something taken from them? And how do we restore the person who did that as well? Because they're in need of reconciliation to themselves, I believe, to God, and to society at large. But for some reason, we just tend to lock them up and call that good, and I don't think that's actually justice.
Yeah, wow, amen to that.
Right.
There's a lot of medic theory in there.
There is.
Well, yeah.
You could see.
And Andrew, I think you were mentioning to me earlier that restorative justice is being taught to the prisoners?
Yes. I first came across this in a book by Bob Kohler, Courage Grows Strong in the Womb.
At the Womb,
And
yes.
it's part memoir and it's part social science. It covers a wide variety of subjects, and it introduced me to restorative justice, which is the idea that you have to work towards reconciliation and heal the wound that the offender has made to the community. Now, I won't outline that further, but it is being taught in the institution which I teach, the irony being that these men are long-term offenders and they have no option of going back. Some of them have very clear ideas of what they could bring back and offer to the community in terms of addressing groups and gangs, etc. But that won't be possible as long as we have this idea of trail them, nail them, jail them, and throw the key away. The restorative justice is in harmony with just the facts that you mentioned, Ben. The atonement theory is a sacrificial theory. It's a theory of substitution. Substitution is sacrifice. As if Jesus didn't go around saying just about anybody who would listen, I desire mercy, not sacrifice.
Yeah, quoting Hosea, there's this whole element within the Old Testament that Jesus picks up, within the Hebrew tradition that Jesus picks up in this argument that the Hebrews are having. And he picks up the prophetic stream of Hosea, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. A lot of people think that mimetic theory is somehow anti-Jewish, Jewish. And what Renee is saying is that Jesus is fully within his Jewish tradition and picks this one strand to live and to die by. Does that sound right? Yeah. So, Ben, you had mentioned that statement by Paul that I love, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, and Paul says God was not counting their sins against them. And it seems that when you were going back to the violence part, the violence is on us. We are the ones who count sins against one another. And it's just such a great anthropological statement, I think, about what it means to be human. I don't know if you had any further thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think the cross, I had written a piece once in response to the Gospel Coalition that, they had argued that the cross was a sign of God's intolerance. And I responded to the Gospel Coalition and said, no, actually the cross is a sign of God's tolerance. That he's willing to come and to pitch his tent among us and to teach us the right way to live at the price of tolerating the violence that we enact against God. And so, yeah, absolutely, we have to begin to recover this idea of reconciliation and restorative justice. There are so many different types of justice, but for some reason here in the West, we've just become drunk on this retributive justice. Honestly, growing up, that was the only kind of justice I had ever known as a conservative evangelical. When I studied biblical justice in seminary under Dean Boardman, an Episcopal priest, my mind was just blown to realize my entire concept of justice was completely whack and not in line what would actually the Bible has to say about justice and restoration. But yeah, I love that you bring up that line by Jesus, because I was just reading that yesterday where he sent some folks away. He said, listen, go and learn what it means when it says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Almost like that was a starting point. Like, listen, you need to go and you need to understand what that means before we can even go on to step 2. Because we desire, God desires mercy. And in fact, in Micah it says that we are to do justice and to love mercy. And then we're to love showing people mercy. And I would just love to recover a Christian culture here in the United States that actually loves mercy. I think that we've tried to do justice, although it's been a perverted sense of justice. But what about loving mercy? I want to hear the second half of what Micah had to say lived out. And even the third part as well, to walk humbly. Those things, I want to see those lived out. I think if we began to really rediscover the radical message of Jesus, we would just really see a Christian culture do some amazing things, because we have the ability to impact our culture for good or for bad. And obviously, if you know who I am, I'm quite critical at the way the previous generation has handled things. But I have a lot of hope for the future generation. If you've ever been to a justice conference, that's a big and growing thing, it's amazing to see just the mainstream Christians who are passionate about restorative justice and fixing what is broken and just making the world a little more right. So I think what you're going to see is a big push in this next generation. I'm excited to imagine what things might look like when my daughter has children, because I think we're moving in the right direction. People are realizing that these old, antiquated ways of viewing things just don't work.
Ben, that's precisely when I was coming up here in the car, I was listening to an ad for a certain drug or pharmaceutical, didn't matter. It was talking about the fact that it was talking about early detection and preventive action is what is needed. Now, that's medicine. That's big science. We know these things are true, but we don't apply them to our society. Restorative justice is about early detection and preventive action. And the strange thing about our culture is that we call ourselves a Christian culture. By the way, we're the only ones who do. And you most often hear that in the media expressed with anger. We're a Christian culture. Well, look at our prison system. We're the most vengeful culture to its offenders. That's perfectly clear. And we are sold on the idea of retributive justice, which is simply vengeance. And if we could have restorative justice, that would be early detection, which we go into these communities and deal at every level with all age groups, and preventive actions, we would not have this. And by the way, yes, I'm with you. I'm hopeful. If I were not hopeful, I certainly wouldn't be trying to, teach long-term offenders about the fact that it's very bad here, and but the fact.
Well, one of the things that I think I learned from mimetic theory in looking at this is why we are addicted to this vengeful, retributive justice, and it is because we are addicted to having someone occupy the place of evil so that we can be good. And until we can find a new way to be good, which I think is what Jesus' ministry was about, we will continue to be addicted to punishing people beyond what just the fact of the punishment itself, but that we derive a benefit from the punishment that we can't live without, and that's to know that we're good.
Form of scapegoating.
It's scapegoating.
Knowing we are good because those people over there who are incarcerated are bad.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, the men I teach, they see that.
Yeah.
And they can't help to see it because some of them have committed a crime when they were 16. Now, medicine is good science. We all need it and want it. Brain science tells us at the age of 16, the agent is not fully equipped to make moral decisions that could possibly land him or her. And by the way, this concerns women as well, have these long-term offender sentences with a life sentence without parole.
Excellent.
Yeah, I just mentioned the other day on my blog, a couple of cases exactly what Andrew's talking about. I believe there's one young lady at 14 years old received life without the possibility of parole plus 4 years.
I love that. How do you add 4 years to forever?
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, and you're right. The brain's not even done growing. The decision-making capabilities. And so to say at 14 years old, you will never have a chance at redemption. You will never have a chance to be restored. People say that sends the right message. It doesn't. It sends the exact wrong message. And even, with the prison overcrowding, we have so many elderly people who do not look anything like the crimes they committed 60, 70 years past, who are clearly no threat to society, and yet they die behind prison walls for justice. It's not justice. We need to restore.
We need to restore. You know what I love about your article, Ben, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to congratulate you. We know that this carceral system is so bad, even the right wing politically knows it needs to be fixed. It's bad psychology. It's bad sociology. It's bad social science. And your blog brings to the fore, it's also bad theology. If we are a Christian culture, if we can say that without anger and vengefulness, then we have to take a very strong look at restorative justice and really push for it.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And of course, if we want to be a Christian nation, the other thing we have to do is we have to renounce all violence. Because you can't simultaneously follow, Jesus, the one who said, hey, love your enemies and thereby be acting as true children of your Father in heaven, and put away your swords. And you cannot be a Christian nation and claim to be following the nonviolent person of Jesus while still promoting such a violent culture. Yeah, we must restore resolution and restoration, but we need to renounce the things that we're doing that just escalate things. When we have a school shooting and the only answer is everybody needs more guns, that just further escalates this entire violent society, and we need to renounce all of that.
Well, Ben, I just got an email across this past week from our Republican senator who was boasting the fact of an $18 million reward to combat gang violence. And the two verbs that keep coming out in that announcement, very pleased about this grant, is fight, combat. So you fight violence with more violence. I guess we're going to send the militia into the streets. All that is part of this romance we have with violence. Everybody's opposed to violence. And the way we prove that we're the good guys is to be able to say, well, they did it, I didn't. That's bad psychology. That's not good social science. It's bad anthropology. And thanks to you, the word's out, it's bad theology.
It is bad theology.
I want to invite our other guests to join us by hitting their cam buttons, and we will bring you into the conversation if you have a comment or a question. Tony Ciccarello is there. I know that Tony has a comment, I think, and Lisa Hadler also does. Tony, if you want to go ahead, and we'll see if your audio is working. All right.
No, we can't hear you, Tony.
Maybe
try now.
No. Maybe hit *6 and we'll see. Lisa, let's go to you. Try to say something and we'll see if your mic is working. Nope.
No.
All right. Let's see where. Try to hit *6 on your phone and we'll see if that'll bring you in. While we're working on that, Ben, you have been saying frequently stuff like we need to get out of the violence game and into the nonviolence game. I think that we have a very good idea of what the violence game looks like, but our imaginations are stifled when it comes to what nonviolence restorative justice looks like.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about how we can go forward in that direction?
I'm not going to lie. It's tough. Embracing Christian nonviolence is tough stuff because sometimes embracing nonviolence can get you killed, as we've seen in so many things. So I take more of a Greg Boyd approach in that, yes, nonviolence might get you killed, but for a Jesus follower, getting killed isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. For me, nonviolence is just one of those things that almost proves that the message of Jesus is true because it's too crazy to make up. Like, it doesn't make sense. And so I read it, and I'm like, you know what? This stuff is so bizarre. It's got to be true. But for me, I've just found a personal freedom in realizing that I can let go and that I no longer have to be responsible for judging whose life is worth more. And for me, it's gotten to the point where, no, I'm willing to die for a lot of things, but I'm willing to kill for nothing. But using, the word creativity, you're right. And this is why so many people, so many Christians reject the doctrine of Christian nonviolence, is because nonviolence requires creativity. And it requires you to think outside the box. A good example would be, Walter Wink talks a lot about this. For example, in the verse where Jesus says, if a man, takes your cloak, give him your garment as well. And so what this was actually a creative nonviolent protest. in that back then poor folks would just have one cloak and that's what they would wear to sleep. They would use it as a blanket to sleep at night. And so what was happening were the rich, they were taking these cloaks as collateral on loans. And so during the day, you would have to give the cloak to them, and you were allowed to go back and get it at night, so you had something to sleep in, because all other than that, you just had your underwear. And so, what Wink would argue that Jesus was saying was that when they take you to court and they sue you for that outer garment, the only thing you have, go ahead and give them your underwear too, and just walk out of there naked and bring shame upon your oppressors, and let the community deal with them for bringing such shame and doing something that was just so horrible. And so Jesus, very much like we see in the life of Gandhi, teaches this really creative response to oppression. And that's the other aspect of why I've noticed so many conservative evangelicals reject Christian nonviolence, is that they think it means, they think of the word pacifism, they think do nothing. It's not do nothing. The nonviolent ethic of Jesus is anything but passive. You deal with oppression, you deal with wrong, you deal with injustice, but you do it without contributing to a cycle that continues to escalate things. You must get more creative. So again, like I said, I'm hopeful for the future. There are a lot of signs that this idea of Christian nonviolence is working its way into mainstream evangelicalism and is no longer just for peace traditions like mine, the Anabaptist tradition. And that people are really catching on that we've got to do this. But you're right. It is hard. It does require creativity, and it actually could get you killed. So I'm not going to lie and say it's just this warm, fuzzy thing. It really could lead to some tough stuff. But for folks like me, we've gotten to the point where, you know what, we realize the only way to defeat this system of violence is to refuse to play, even if that costs me my own life. I'm opting out. I don't want anything to do with it. And if I die, I die. But I'm not going to contribute to this system of tit for tat. It just doesn't work.
Yeah. Oftentimes when people say, oh, pacifism is just going to get you killed, I want to respond, violence has a pretty good record of getting people killed.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
As the French say, touché.
Right, yeah.
Jesus, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Gandhi were all killed by their own. There's a pattern there.
Right, yeah.
Right. Where there is meaning. That's big science. Yeah. Science looks for patterns.
Yeah. Okay, Lisa and Tony. Let's try to go with Lisa first. Lisa, try to talk into your phone, and we'll see what we can do.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Excellent.
Well, it's hard for me to put my thoughts into words, really, but I served a congregation that was a victim of a crime. And as part of the same event, 2 members of the congregation were victims of a violent crime, of arson. The church was embezzled from, and then the embezzler committed arson against 2 members of the congregation. And it was interesting to me to watch my good liberal church that until then I had been preaching mimetic theory and restorative justice, and I had worked in the mid-'90s for 4 years as director of a victim offender reconciliation program. So I had professionally taught restorative justice and trained people in it. And so it was part of my preaching, and they thought that was great, and they were all receptive to it until they were victims of a crime. And then it was all retribution. And the offender ended up in prison. She's in prison in Illinois, and I ended up losing my job. And but it struck me that when it was all theory, it was great, and they thought it was wonderful. And but when violence touched them, the only way they could think to respond was more violence. And it's been still very difficult for me to even function in the church, because I think we talk a good game, but when the rubber hits the road, we're not really there. So I don't know. That's just where I am. So.
Well, Lisa, that is a very poignant story, and among the many things that occur to me is that when you say the only thing they can think of is violent execution, precisely that isn't thinking, you see. That is not thinking. That's reaction. They are responding to violence with violence, which we all do. I lash out. We all do. Nobody's immune. If we could immunize ourselves, we wouldn't need the cross. We wouldn't need Jesus. And so Christianity, of course, is a work in progress. We all know that, and there will be terrible disappointments. And your loss of your job is simply your being outcast puts you, in that corner with the victims of a crowd which responds to violence with violence.
Yeah, Ben, do you have any thoughts on that too, or?
Well, I actually connect with this story a lot. Unfortunately, I was pastor of a church here in Maine that 3 years ago was attacked by arson, and so it was interesting. It was a tough experience. Thankfully, the building wasn't destroyed; they were able to save it. But I had a conversation with one of the elderly women the very next Sunday. We weren't able to hold services in the church, but we held services on the front lawn. And the media was there, and I preached a sermon on love of enemies and forgiveness. And one of the elderly women approached me, and she said, she's like, all I can feel is compassion towards whoever did this. And she said, is it wrong that I don't want them to be punished? And it just gave way to a really beautiful dialogue on forgiveness and love of enemies. But it's hard because there is a dance. Like, I'm not saying we need to abolish prisons. Like, clearly there are some people who are dangerous to society and need to be segregated because that's what's loving for everyone, including themselves. It's not loving to let somebody go out and continue to damage their own soul by committing things. But it's always this line that you're walking, and it's hard, especially from a Christian point of view. It's just, where discernment and compassion comes in. I remember for us, the lady got a short prison term, but I encouraged people to reach out and to not hold anger and to express love towards our enemy in that way. But that's tough what you went through. It's hard, but you're right. When it comes to the big stuff, it's hard to practice nonviolence right away. And that's why I think it's really important that we need to begin teaching it at the basic level and so much earlier on. Because often we think of nonviolence in terms of just like the overt acts of violence. But what we need to teach people is that this goes down to a small level. It means when my wife snaps at me, I don't snap back. It means, these little things that you do, that it's, when Jesus, says to not resist an evildoer, what he's saying when you really exegete the Greek is to not respond in kind, to not respond tit for tat, because it just escalates things. And so I think part of the problem is we're not teaching kids this early enough on a small level. And so then when we ask people to practice nonviolence on the big level, it's just way too crazy. I remember growing up, we were always taught on the playground, if somebody starts it, you can finish it. Those are the rules. And that meant that somebody picks a fight with you, you can fight back. As I look back on that as an adult and as a theologian, I'm like, that was the worst message that ever could have been sent to me. So we have to start teaching kids younger and younger the principles of nonviolence that work itself out in very small ways. Is that when somebody hurts you or disappoints you, even unintentionally, you don't respond in a way that is going to make them feel the same way. That's not how we feel whole again. And I think if people start to realize this on a younger level, then when we start introducing to them the real radical aspects of nonviolence, like get rid of your gun, it won't seem so crazy to them. So I empathize. I understand why nonviolence just seems too radical for some people, and it's because they weren't introduced to it on the most basic level where it's practiced.
That's great. Tony, we lost your video, but I think we may still have you on the audio. Can you try to talk? Try to say something?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there you go.
Excellent.
Is that me?
That's you.
It's just been an interesting conversation. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead with your comment.
Yes. You know, I think that so much depends on what we think about as Christianity. So much we just identify Christianity with beliefs and the idea, certain dogmas and ideas. But I think the basic thing about the Christianity is that in order to really follow through with these ideas, one needs to be transformed, and that the whole process of transformation is and growth is something that takes throughout one's life. But the comment I had originally was that individually, the way our society, the philosophy and the ideas that our society sees that the individual has selected evil, and that's why they've done bad things, and that we are not, because we did not select this, and so that's how we look at the problem, and they should be put away and to get rid of the evil. And there isn't that sense of the interdividual that we are formed by the society and we are formed by the culture. We just don't kind of see that. So that was the comment I wanted to make, and that in fact sometimes it's just not always a matter of teaching, and I don't know how this is whole part of the Christian message, and what you do in a community and what you do in a church is to transform oneself to this nonviolent way, because when push comes to shove, as Lisa said in her church, we act to protect ourselves, and we don't see that this is something going against what our Christianity is. That was just the comment I had on that.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah.
Well, Tony, I thank you for that, because one of the key ideas of Hermetic theory, you use the word interdividual. We are not individuals in any way. And I really think that, because we're talking about this, about our carceral system, the worm in the apple, in the American apple, is our individualism. And I didn't figure that on my own. A nice Frenchman called Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a book about democracy in America, and he sent up a flick. He said, "Watch this. This is really, this is something new on the political historical horizon." Now, on the other hand, then, it isn't that new. It comes from the Reformation, more than anything. And we have tremendous benefits from the Reformation in the terms of here I stand, the individual conscience as having a certain authority, etc. We get these bad effects, i.e. a punitive idea of God's justice. Mm-hmm. And so the individualism, obviously it fuels our whole gun culture. I don't think any imagination is required to that. Right. Maybe we take guns to church, nobody could burn it down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of great comments in the chat room. I'd love for Matt to come in and make his comment, or I could just read them. But we've got some just comments of support. Ben, you were talking about on the small, like family level, the practice of nonviolence, and Kathy Frost says that's a very important message. Ben, practical nonviolence on the small level is such an important point that you made. And another one, Tim cites Brown. I can't find it right now, but he says talks about the importance of training people towards nonviolent response and how important that is. And Matthew, I'm going to read your comment because I loved it. It's about not only changing our minds but also our bodies when it comes to this topic. And he's talking about Lisa's story, and he says, I wonder if part of our issue sometimes is that people can change our thoughts without changing the realities that we embody. To change what we embody takes more than changing one's profession. It involves changing one's nous, one's mind, intuition. for the latter practices like embodied prayer, daily charity, and even somatics. And I'm wondering if Andrew or Ben, you had any thoughts on that?
Well, very quickly, yes, I mean, Christianity is not a dogma, it's a practice. It's about transformation, a conversion. And it takes training. It's why we have churches, we have liturgies, we have prayers. We need to exercise ourselves, and that we're not these thinking things. The mind and the heart are part of a system, and we have to work. In other words, I believe it was in Ben's article, but I've seen it other places, holistically.
Yeah, Ben, any thoughts on that comment, or?
Yes, no, I mean, I agree. To me, it all comes down to discipleship and spiritual formation, in that, we've used those terms so much throughout history, and I think there are some areas where the church, big C, has done well, and some issues where it hasn't done well. And of course, not to be redundant, but I think here in the West, what we've left out of Christian discipleship is the area of nonviolence. I believe it is one of the, there's so much about it that is unclear, but to me, the doctrine of nonviolence is one of the teachings of Jesus that is the most clear, and it could have the biggest impact on the culture around us. But the problem is those of us who are talking about it are seen as being folks that are on the fringes and the outsiders. And so my hope is that we will rework this back into discipleship as we teach people, well, what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to follow Jesus? And this being a missing element, as I talk about in my upcoming book where I illustrate 12 elements that I think that we've missed. Nonviolence is one of them, and sorry for the shameless plug, but there it is.
Oh, no, we've already got you booked to come on and talk about your
book
when it comes out, so that will be excellent. But I think that in discipleship and Christian formation, that's where the idea of individuality really comes in as well, because we are formed by a culture of violence. We are raised in it, we are reared in it, we're all imperfect human beings that our parents love us, of course, but, we're creatures of rivalry and conflict, and we're formed that way. And so to be reformed, to be formed into a new creation, requires intentionality and discipline and practice and the knowledge that that's how we became something through that very process, and we can become something else through that very process. And I think that's where the Christian formation, Ben, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm very engaged with Christian education in the early years. And I think it has to start right in the preschool classroom.
Right, oh, absolutely. And I think you use the right word in reform. One of my favorite passages in the Bible, is where Jesus says, unless you come like a little child, so he encourages them to become like children. Now, when I was a kid, the way that was explained to me is that when you're a child, you believe whatever we tell you. So Jesus was just saying to believe and to do whatever we tell you. But of course now, as I look back on it, as a theologian, Jesus was saying, rethink everything. Like, unless you're willing to rethink everything that you were taught about what it means to be a God follower, then you're probably not going to get it, And so that reformation, that willing to step back and to become like a little child who learns all over again, who becomes inquisitive and who becomes willing to set aside understandings that weren't correct and frameworks which didn't fit. And so I hope that we can encourage people to rethink everything and to do that reformation that includes these missing elements. And you're right, it has to start young. It's why in my home, nonviolent ethic is I try to find any opportunity to teach it. Because I know that if I do not teach it in the small phases, that when, my kids get older, that I'm going to have a much harder time getting them to embrace total nonviolence.
Good. That's great.
Well, when are you going to write a parenting book, Ben?
I'm already started on my next one, which is about being a Christian outsider. It's called Without a Tribe. So I'm not sure when I'll get to a parenting one. But
okay.
That would be, I actually, at some point, I wouldn't mind writing one for adoptive parents of children from international situations, and from some aspect of dealing with special needs within older children that have unique psychological needs. But that would be a little bit later on in my career after I put out a few other things.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we're coming to the end of our hour, and I want to thank everybody for sticking with us through those technical difficulties. And before we end, there are just two more comments that I want to get out there. Lee Cheek says, yes, training the brain to move from sympathetic division to parasympathetic. Neuroscience is our friend here. Great research done in trauma recovery world. And that's, beautiful stuff. And that along with Lisa's next comment are topics for a whole nother chat. Beautiful stuff. One thing, Lisa says, one thing that strikes me about the need for guns by Christians is that it challenges the idea that we have achieved eternal life. I mean, if we're going to heaven or whatever, what do we have to be afraid of? Why do we need guns? Now, the fear question is great, is an awesome question to ask in that. And again, it's a whole nother show, and we should do that. And right at the end here, Tony Ciccarello says, right on, Suzanne.
Oh.
Nicely done. I don't remember what that was for, but right on, everyone. Thank you for being with us.
Yes.
Andrew and Ben, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Next week, what are we going to have next week?
Richard Schenk, Father Richard Schenk from Germany,
friend of mine.
calling in. Oh yeah, he is a great guy, smart and articulate and
hugely learned.
Oh yeah, way.
So we have to rethink everything, but we don't have to reinvent. We know so much, and we have to rethink what we know.
There you go. Richard is one of the main organizers of the colloquium on.
He is the organizer.
He is the organizer on the colloquium on violence and religion conference
this year
that is going to be held in Germany.
In Germany,
is that correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Near Munich, yes.
In Germany in
July.
Okay, great.
Exactly.
That conference is going to be about battling to the end. Renee Girard's latest epic book. And so we'll discuss that. It's had some of its own controversy for that book, so we'll discuss that with Richard. The conference is going to be about Nomadic theory in World War I. So we'll do all of that with Richard Schenk next week. It'll be a fascinating conversation, and I can't wait to see you all then.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you again.
Thank you.